Okay, historians, let's get our heads around the February Revolution of 1917. Pretty important event. Here are some of the scenes of what is going on in February and January 1917. We can see the Winter Palace of the Tsar here. We've got crowds gathering outside. It's the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. So at the very spot that those crowds were shot by Tsar Nicholas in 1905, 12 years later, it's a site of protest and commemoration. It's also the time of International Women's Day, late February 1917. And it's women were one of the disenfranchised groups within Russia after the reforms of the October Manifesto of 1905 and then the changes of 1906 in the Duma system. And one of the culmination events of this February Revolution is the mutiny of troops. The Petrograd garrison, the St. Petersburg capital army are becoming more and more unreliable. The Tsar can't necessarily rely upon their support. And this all feeds into the revolution of February 1917 and the later revolution of October 1917. So let's talk about these events that we call the February Revolution that take place in January and February 1917. And one of the things I'd remind you is that often this revolution can be referred to as the March Revolution because of the different calendars and so forth. We're going to use the Russian dates here. And it's very much events that are centered on the Russian capital, Petrograd or St. Petersburg, or even later gets called Leningrad after the Bolshevik leader. Petrograd's right up in the north. It's sometimes referred to as the Venice of the North. It's up near the Finn border. In fact, the border with Finland is so close that one of the big railway stations in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, is known as Finland Station. That becomes very important when Lenin arrives in April 1917 back and delivers his April theses. Finland Station becomes very important. The Petrograd-St. Petersburg name change and interchangeability about this time very much represents a torn sense in Russia of whether they are a Western country, St. Petersburg being a Germanic sounding name, or Petrograd, the city of St. Peter in Russian. So is it an Eastern nation or a Western nation? It even plays out in some of the names. But let's get back to our storyline. Bloody Sunday's anniversary, January 9th, 1917, is pretty much the start of a series of protests which lead to the collapse of Tsarism. Ultimately, we could even argue that Bloody Sunday incident ultimately connects to the end of Tsar Nicholas's reign. 150,000 people are demonstrating in the streets of Petrograd on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Why are there so many out at this time? Well, there are strikes going on. There are food shortages, partly connected to a bitter winter, partly connected to the war. There are factory closures, economic difficulties. Ongoing protests and sporadic violence are happening all over St. Petersburg, Petrograd at this time. A key event is in late February. After this month of protests that are on, well, I'd like to say a smaller scale, but certainly not a small scale, we have the International Women's Day March, which was scheduled for February 23rd. That march was joined by strikers and unemployed steel workers from one of the great industries of St. Petersburg, the big steel factories there. About 100,000 more protesters also joined the women and the strikers and the steel workers who are there protesting food shortages. A suggestion is that you had as many as 300,000, nearly 500,000 if you think about it, protesters in the street, but accurate numbers aren't kept. Certainly on February 25th, a couple of days later, there are citywide strikes and protests which shut down the entirety of the city. Approximately 300,000 protesters are in the streets and the police order them to disperse. The head of police, the Tsarist police, order the crowds to break up, or the military and police would fire upon the crowds, just as they did in 1905. The next day, the crowds call the bluff of the police. More or less working the logic, you can't shoot 300,000 of us. The crowds are back in defiance of these orders, and the military don't act to crack down on the protests. It would appear behind the scenes that the Petrograd garrison of troops is not willing to follow orders, and its officers are kind of confused about what the next steps to take are. This comes to a head on the 27th, when the garrison itself, about 160,000 soldiers, pretty much the only police and military force in the capital, actually come out into the streets and join with the protesters and offer them protection from any of the police and army that might remain loyal to the Tsar. In the face of this mutiny, in the face of these huge protests, leaders of the Fourth Duma go to the Winter Palace and they meet with the Tsar, and they urge him to make the reforms that the protesters and the army are demanding. In response, Tsar Nicholas II dismisses the Duma. He is still an autocratic ruler in his mind. This leads us then to the revolutionary event itself. A group of 12 reform-minded moderates from the dismissed Duma form then a provisional committee of the Duma. Radical groups on the same day form the Petrograd Soviet, a word that means committee, of soldiers, sailors and workers deputies, basically elected officials of soldiers, sailors and workers. This Petrograd Soviet later falls under the influence of the Bolsheviks. The Duma's provisional committee is dominated by moderates, largely members of the bourgeoisie and aristocracy who are dissatisfied with the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. On the 28th, both of these groups support the formation of a provisional, they support the formation of a provisional government that is going to run the country until a new parliament is elected. And that new election would lead to the creation of a constitutional assembly. Hopefully you heard that through my speech stumbles. So looking at our images here, these 12 faces here, these 12 men are the provisional committee. They are the ones who approached the Tsar. They are the ones who essentially refuse to disband after the Duma, the Fourth Duma, is dismissed. The provisional government, in a group photograph here, exists only until a constitutional assembly, a new parliament, is elected, with whole wide-ranging elections across the nation. But across town, the Petrograd Soviet of soldiers, sailors and workers' deputies are meeting in a very different sort of group. In early March, as a result of this, the Tsar abdicates, and that's our February Revolution.